Today I'm going to cover the most horrifying forms of torture, but not the ones in hell, the ones in the real world. First, let's talk a bit about the nature of torture. It's the act of inflicting extreme physical and mental pain. The barbarity of torture is that it strips away your humanity. Because when you are subjected to brutal physical or mental harm for purposes like extracting information or punishment, you've been turned into a tool, no longer a human being. Basically, a torture has 5 purposes. One is to force a confession to get information quickly. This is often seen in the context of war or fighting crime, to get information about their comrades. However, a fair amount of research suggests that torture is often ineffective. First, because it can make the person being tortured more resilient and they'll refuse to talk. And second, if someone is tortured too much, their mind is no longer sound. Therefore, the information they give won't be reliable. The second purpose of this is punishment and deterrence. These would typically be public torture sessions in front of everyone. It both punishes the offender and makes those who are considering or about to commit a crime too scared to do it. Third is to assert power and control. To put it simply, if I can do anything I want to your mind and body, then I have absolute power. Okay, that's enough theory. Let's get down to it. The heretic's fork, it's a collar, but it's been customized with a fork, one prong presses under the chin and the other against the sternum. This collar is fastened around the neck, forcing the person being interrogated to keep their head held high. During the interrogation, every time they open their mouth, the 2 prongs dig in deeper. And holding your neck up for so long gets tiring. When you can't hold it up any longer, you have to talk, or else the fork skewers you from both ends. The scold's bridle. This is exactly like a muzzle, except it's used on people. It's a metal frame with a section containing sharp spikes on top that's used to cover the mouth, and the spiked part pins down the tongue. It was used to punish women who nagged or gossiped about others. The blood eagle. This was a Viking method of torture for their enemies. The victim's back would be cut open, and then their ribs and lungs would be pulled outwards. Oh, and there you have it, like an eagle spreading its wings. This causes the victim to die a slow and agonizing death. However, people online say this method is only described in literary works or in legends and myths and has been exaggerated because there's no evidence confirming the blood eagle ever really existed. With my limited knowledge, it sounds an awful lot like butchering a duck. The insect boat. This is an extremely cruel style. The victim's arms and legs are tied tightly to a small boat, which is then pushed out into a polluted, stagnant body of water. They are smeared with honey and milk to turn them into a living piece of candy and attract insects. Then the victim is forced to drink that same honey and milk mixture, causing them to vomit and have constant diarrhea. Insects like bees, ants, and flies will swarm, bite, and burrow into the victim's body until they die. And this process is repeated every morning, making it one of the most horrific and prolonged forms of torture. The most famous story in history involving this punishment is that of Mithridates, a young Persian soldier in the army of Artaxerxes II. During a power struggle between 2 royal brothers, Mithridates accidentally struck down Cyrus, and the king ordered him to keep silent about it. It was like the king wanted to be seen as the one who eliminated his own brother to consolidate his power. But Mithridates let it slip, boasting, "No, I was the one who did it, not the king." The king was so furious he sentenced him to be devoured by insects. Mithridates endured this torture for 17 days before passing away from a severe infection. Branding iron. For those of you who watch Chinese martial arts films, this will be familiar. This is a metal seal that is heated and then pressed onto the victim's skin, leaving a mark that permanently unlocks the scar skin. It was meant to punish and remind the victim as well as others of the crime for the rest of their life. Or it was used by masters to brand their slaves as a way of showing ownership. Compared to the methods mentioned above, I find this one to be quite light. The brazen bull. This is a method that many people have probably heard of. It's considered one of the most infamous torture devices of ancient Greece, invented by Paralyus. For the tyrant Phalaris, a figure famous for his love of torturing others. This tyrant forced the man to invent a device to help him pass the time. And so the man created a bull made of bronze that could lock a person inside and be heated by a fire from the outside. The victim would essentially be steamed alive inside. And then inside there was a special tube connected directly to the bull statue's nose. When the victim screamed inside, it would sound like a bull's bellow accompanied by steam jetting out to enhance the realism. Within about 10 minutes, the victim would go from medium rare to charred and then overcooked. A fun fact is that the first person to be executed by this punishment was the man who created it, the breaking wheel. According to descriptions, this method involved breaking the victim's bones and then weaving their body into a large wheel. Afterward, they would be hoisted up high for birds to peck at and the sun to burn. In some other versions, they weren't hoisted up. Instead, a fire would be lit underneath and the wheel would be spun, or the wheel would be rolled down from a high mountain. The breast ripper, also known as the iron spider. It was used to punish women accused of adultery, witchcraft, abortion, or becoming pregnant out of wedlock. Two men would use two heated pincers to grasp and pull at the breasts, causing the skin in that area to be torn off, inflicting injury. In short, it caused disfigurement of the chest. Nowadays, it has evolved into a form for women who are into BDSM, water droplet torture. But wait, there's some really interesting trivia here. Some sources say this method was first described and practiced by the Italian lawyer and Dr. Hippolytus in the 15th century. The purpose and method aren't too different, usually to extract confessions from stubborn prisoners. The victim's limbs and head would be completely restrained. Above them would be a basin of water with a small hole allowing drops to fall below. The victim's head would be held in place so that when the water drops fell, they would land right in the middle of their forehead. At first, they might not feel anything, but over time, the falling drops would get faster, causing discomfort and psychological stress. Later, it would feel like a hammer striking your head, sort of like how a steady drip hollows a stone. To make this ordeal more intense, the victim might be placed in a sealed, soundproof room with no light. Basically, this method was created to destroy a prisoner's spirit. The very act of being unable to move for a long period of time is already extremely uncomfortable. Add to that the constant dripping of water on one spot on your head, and it gets pretty infuriating. It's like if you lie down on 100 nails, you might be okay. But if you step on a single nail, you can bet you're either getting a tetanus shot or you're a goner. The White Room. In some documents, it's referred to as white torture. This method was commonly used in Iran, the US, and Venezuela. A prisoner would be locked in a room where everything from the walls, floor, and ceiling to their clothes and food was white. The room is completely soundproofed, and they would be locked inside for months or even years. Although it doesn't cause any physical pain, after a long period of isolation, one can develop psychological disorders or even go insane. From what I've researched, this method causes a loss of all senses and personal identity, leading to prolonged paranoia. There are no public records of who endured this form of torture the longest. That's because it was often used on political prisoners, so it's a rather sensitive topic. However, there was one man on record who endured it for about 8 months, and after he got out, he couldn't even remember his own parents' faces. And, of course, he also lost the mannerisms of a normal person, torn apart by 4 horses. This wasn't so much a form of torture as it was a method of execution. It originated first appearing in the year 1610. It was a punishment issued by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. In late 1781, this method was also used by the Spanish colonial government on Peruvian rebel leaders. In Europe, being torn apart by 4 horses was also used to punish heretics. The victim would have their 4 limbs tied with ropes, which were then attached to 4 horses facing 4 different directions. After that, the riders would make the horses gallop as fast as possible. In cases where the horses wouldn't run, they would shout or do something to startle them, causing the 4 ropes to pull taut and rip the victim's body into 4 pieces. And typically being torn apart by 4 horses was a public execution meant to instill fear in everyone. Another variation of this was being torn apart by 5 horses. It's just like the one above, but with 1 more horse. And that extra horse was tied to the victim's neck. In history, there was a man who plotted to assassinate Qin Shi Huang, but he failed. So he was convicted of treason for attempting to harm the emperor and was sentenced to be torn apart by 5 horses. The finger clamp. It was often used to force confessions or to punish thieves. This device has 2 steel bars with a screw on top that you can turn. When questioned, if the person refused to confess, the screw would be tightened another turn until their fingers were crushed flat. The 18 and over crowd is not going to like this. Retrieving the coin, used for punishing pickpockets. This punishment was common in medieval Europe. They would boil a cauldron of oil, throw a coin or the item the thief had just stolen into it, and force him to retrieve it. I wonder if someone stole sandals, would they throw the sandals in there? There are 2 versions of this ordeal. In the first version, if the accused refused to retrieve the item, they would be found guilty. So if you agree you're innocent, I don't see it written anywhere that the opposite is true. In the second version, both the accuser and the accused had to dip their hands into the cauldron of boiling oil. Whoever wasn't injured after dipping their hand in the cauldron was considered pure and was pronounced innocent LMAO. I don't really understand the logic of the second version, but both versions were created with the goal of making thieves so scared they wouldn't dare steal again, or at least not for a very long time. The rat and the hot coal. This originated in old-timey Europe. They would capture a rat and starve it for many days, then put it in an iron cage placed upside down on the victim's stomach. On top of that cage, there would be a place to hold hot coals. The rat, feeling the heat, would start to panic and look for a way to escape. Of course, a rat is smart enough to know it can't bite through iron, so it would choose a softer spot to gnaw its way out. In other words, biting into the victim's abdomen. Many people are already afraid of rats, so add to that the combo of feeling it bite into your stomach and then gobble up your internal organs. That's a pretty extreme form of torture. In Game of Thrones, there's a pretty gruesome scene of this. The Kangyu, a heavy wooden board, is locked around the victim's neck, making movement or eating very difficult. This was used on prisoners for public humiliation. It not only caused physical pain, but also made the victim feel ashamed in front of the crowd. We often see this scene in old Chinese movies. I used to hear the saying, imprisoned until the kang is eaten by woodworms. Well, the kangyi is this thing, so it means being in prison for a very long time. Meaning you're in prison for so long that woodworms start eating into the kang. Castor oil, its original name is castor oil. This is a non-volatile vegetable oil extracted from the seeds of the castor plant using a cold press method. The parts of the castor plant itself are actually extremely dangerous because they contain a poison called ricin. After drinking a large amount of castor oil, the victim would suffer from abdominal pain and uncontrollable defecation. Some side effects can include skin irritation, diarrhea, dehydration, or serious complications for people with gastrointestinal diseases. Afterwards, the victim would be beaten to extract information. Anyone who is stubborn would likely end up covered in their own shit. This form of torture could cause the victim to die quickly from constant dehydration. The pear of anguish. It was mainly used for interrogations and was popular in 17th century Europe. This is a pear-shaped metal device with segments that can be separated. It was inserted into the victim's mouth or anus. Then it was gradually expanded until they couldn't take it anymore and were forced to confess. But it was also used in the medical field, such as helping to open the mouth for dental treatment, or even as a tool for stretching shoes, socks, or gloves. The head crusher, well, it's designed like an oil press. There's a crank on top used to push a metal cap downwards. It would tighten on the victim's head, causing excruciating pain, deforming the facial bones and joints, and finally crushing the skull. Used for interrogation or to punish those who committed horrible crimes, it's basically a fruit press. Torture by sound. Sound has a huge effect on human brainwaves, so humans found a way to use sound to torture their own kind. They might use high-volume infrasound or piercing sounds for long periods of time. The goal is to cause fatigue, discomfort, and nervous tension. The CIA has used music to torture prisoners, specifically by playing the song My Love by the band Westlife at maximum volume on repeat. This song is actually pretty good, but I guess it would be annoying. The iron chair. It was designed with the added feature of sharp spikes on the seat and armrests. The victim would be forced to sit for hours, sometimes for many days, and with all those spikes underneath, they would have to constantly shift around, unable to sit still. And then there were versions that even had a fire lit underneath. For anyone with hemorrhoids, sitting on this would be annihilating. The human anchor meant for sailors who stole or sold information to pirates. As the cage gets hotter, the rats panic and try to escape the heat by burrowing. The victim would be dragged from one side of the ship to the other. If the crime was serious, they would be tied to the ship's keel. The victim could drown or be covered in injuries from hitting the hull, the keel, or underwater objects. If the intention wasn't to kill them, this process would be repeated over and over until they died. The images for this are pretty gruesome and would definitely get me demonetized, so I'll just use this temporary picture. Also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of punishment from ancient China. Originates from the way this method was carried out. After every beat of the tongue drum, a piece of the victim's flesh would be sliced off. First the fingers, toes, eyes, nose, mouth, and tongue. Then came the limbs and fleshier areas like the shoulders and thighs, starting from the groin area, working down toward the head, or until they died from the pain or blood loss. Then the executioner would deliver the final blow to prove that the criminal's punishment was complete. This punishment was applied to those who committed unforgivable crimes like treason, harming the emperor, or killing their parents. There was a Chinese general named Yuan Chonghuan. He was falsely convicted, accused of colluding with the enemy to betray the king. This was because the emperor fell for a divisive plot by Hong Taiji. The victim would be placed in a coffin or simply thrown into a pit and then buried under soil, the pendulum of death. A sharp blade is suspended over the victim like a clock's pendulum, and with each swing, it lowers itself further down. The victim below is tightly bound hand and foot and can only watch as the blade gets closer and closer to their body. But this is just a fictional device from Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Pit and the Pendulum. It later inspired many horror films like The Raven or The House of Usher. The rack. Used from ancient Greece all the way to 17th century England, the victim was tied down on a rectangular wooden frame stretching their body. Specifically, their hands and feet were pulled in opposite directions, dislocating joints and tearing ligaments, mainly to force a confession. If the victim refused to confess, they could be continuously stretched until their limbs were torn from their body. And because of how horrific this was, many victims would confess to crimes they didn't even commit. The Scavenger's Daughter. I don't know why it has that name. Maybe it's because you're forced to crouch down like a beggar. This one is the opposite of the last one. Instead of stretching, it compresses. This device would use compression to force the victim into a crouch position, and it usually ended within an hour because it could cause internal bleeding, sending you to meet your maker. While researching, I found another device with the same name, but it was used differently. You would put your head, hands, and feet into those rings? I guess it was more uncomfortable than painful. Or maybe I just don't know since I've never experienced it. The tongue tearer. The name is pretty self-explanatory. This was a punishment in medieval Europe for people who committed blasphemy or told lies. It was a clamp that would tear the tongue, causing excruciating pain. The victim couldn't speak, but ironically, it was often used to force a confession. Upside down hanging. Instead of having their hand in front, the victim's hands would be tied behind their back and they'd be hung by ropes tied to their wrists. This would dislocate their shoulders, and you could even add weights to make it more painful. The gibbet cage. This looks a lot like the game Hangman. It was used in 18th century England for pirates and criminals and was later banned in 1834 for being too barbaric. The victim would be locked inside an iron cage and hung up high in a public place. And then they were just left there to die amid the public's scorn, to die in shame. They probably died of starvation or something, but what could be more humiliating than the public scorn, right? Or if they were put in the cage after death, the corpse would be left there until it completely decomposed. The bamboo. This is an ancient form of torture from Asia. The victim would be tied down securely in a sitting or lying position over a young bamboo shoot. Bamboo grows very quickly. It can grow several dozen centimeters in just one day. So the bamboo would grow very quickly and pierce through the victim's body. The thing is, they would still be able to feel the bamboo piercing through their internal organs. Flaying. This one will 100% get flagged by YouTube, so I won't be using any images. Well, you heard it. The victim is basically turned into the colossal titan and would probably die from shock and infection. The Judas chair, also known as the Judas cradle. This one comes from the time of the Spanish Inquisition. What we have is a torture device with a pyramid-shaped seat. The victim was placed on top, and ropes were used to gradually lower them, forcing their body weight onto the sharp point. This would cause their body to be torn apart. The name Judas chair comes from Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. That's why this punishment was often used for heretics, or those who betrayed the faith. The Iron Maiden. It's an iron coffin with spikes and sharp nails inside, and when it was closed, it would pierce the victim. But it's mostly just an embellished legend. There's no real evidence or artifacts to prove it actually existed. The one in this museum is just a replica made to attract tourists. In shows like Naruto Shippuden, I don't know if it was part 1 or 2, they also had this. It's in the scene where they go shopping for magic props in Hong Kong. And then in the movie The Old Guard, you know, the one about the immortals, the Vietnamese actress, what's her name? Ngo Tan Vun gets locked in one of those and then thrown into the river. No, wait, it was the sea, wasn't it? The Spanish donkey. This was a common punishment in the 16th century. They would use a sharp, wedge-shaped wooden device about 1.5 meters long. The victim would be forced to sit astride it as if riding a donkey. Then rocks would be tied to their feet, and this would cause severe damage to the pelvis and groin area. The wooden donkey. This punishment appeared in China during the Northern Song dynasty. It involved a wooden horse with wheels underneath for movement and a large wooden phallus as big as a pestle on the horse's back. It was specifically used to punish adulterous women. They would be forced to sit on this phallus, and as the horse was pushed along, the phallus would move, and destroy everything inside the woman's uterus, leaving her permanently maimed or even killing her. According to records, the first person to suffer this punishment was Wang Po, the one who supposedly arranged the sinful affair between Pan Jinlian and Jimin Qing in the water margin. But water margin is a work of fiction, so it's not really according to records. Actually, in the novel, Wang Po was executed by Wu Song, but in real history, she was in fact arrested and put on trial. And finally, punishment by the wooden donkey. Crocodile shears. These are shears that have jaws that look like a crocodile's. They work just like a pair of iron shears. And they would heat that part up to cut off the victim's limbs, and if the offender had committed rape, they'd use it to sever his penis. And those are just a few of the agonizing punishments in this world. If you know of any other methods, please comment below. Goodbye and see you again.